for people who are really afraid that they're going to look less than perfect in a meeting if they can't answer every single question, what are you most afraid of? And plan for that. Plan for what you're most afraid of. So often it's, I'm going to be asked a question I don't know the answer to. Okay, that's going to happen someday. Someday you're going to be asked that. So what will you do if that does happen? And then you sort of plot out your thoughts, your plan. You can think about what resources I want to bring into the room with me if I'm feeling like I don't have adequate experience in this area. It's all about taking control of a situation that's making you feel like you don't have enough control.
That was Kim Meninger. I am Catherine Alonso. Welcome back to Change in You. I am so glad that you're here. Kim is an executive coach. She's a podcaster. She's a public speaker, and she talks a lot about imposter syndrome, amongst other things. But how I found her was her work on imposter syndrome and her phenomenal podcast. And I am so excited to have this conversation with her and to share it with you, because I think that imposter syndrome impacts all of us in different ways. And Kim and I dig into that. And it is so relevant for change work for many reasons. One of them being that imposter syndrome can be more prevalent and can come up for us when we're in periods of uncertainty and when we're in periods of fluctuation. And as you know, making change, doing work that is focused on social impact and making a difference in the world is inherent. It's just inherently associated with uncertainty and fluctuation and periods of transition. Also, as Kim shares in this episode, imposter syndrome can bring about shrinking behaviors. And oftentimes change work requires us to be bold and to take risks. And so those two things combined just goes to show what an incredible obstacle imposter syndrome can be for those of us who want to make a difference in the world. I am so incredibly grateful to Kim for this conversation, because she really just sort of lays it out, what it is, how it might be affecting you, and what you can do about it. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Kim Meninger. Kim Meninger, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. And we are going to just jump into one of my, I don't know if it's one of my favorite topics, but I think it's so important. It's such a vital topic. So to kick us off, tell me a little bit about you and what you do.
Well, I'm a leadership coach and consultant, and I tend to describe the work I do as focused on helping people navigate what makes it hard to be human at work. So there are all kinds of resources available to help us grow our skills and our competencies in different areas. But I tend to look at the world through the lens of, what do I do when I know what I'm technically supposed to do, but I feel like an imposter, or certain situations make me anxious, or I don't feel psychologically safe enough to take risks. And so I try to reveal that messy human side of the workplace that gets a little less attention, and really offer strategies to help people be more confident and just show up more effectively in their workplaces.
And what was your journey to getting to what you're doing today?
So I always wanted to be a therapist. That was what I dreamed of doing from the time I was a child. And so everything I did was oriented in that direction until a couple of years after I graduated from college and decided not to go into a PhD program. So I stumbled into the high tech industry. I was working in relationship management. So my job was to manage partnerships with different kinds of entities in our ecosystem. But I found myself really drawn to the human side of work. But I was just really overwhelmed by the technical side of it. I felt just woefully unprepared for the conversations I was having with other people. I was constantly comparing myself and feeling like I didn't measure up. And so, I stayed there for a while. There were aspects of it that I thought were, aligned with how I wanted to show up. But ultimately, I went on maternity leave with my older son and just had one of those moments, one of those rare moments where you get to stop for a minute and ask yourself, is this really what I'm meant to do? Is this really where I'm getting my meaning and fulfillment from? And, I had a lot of privilege having a husband who had a great job that I was able to take some time off and really think about that. And that's what led me in this direction. And I say very sincerely that my goal is to be the resource to others that I wish I had during that time. I wish that I had the kind of support that I try to offer to people who are coming up behind me.
Mm-hmm. And who do you work with? Who are the people that you help?
So for the past number of years, I've been primarily focused on supporting women. And I think that's primarily because they are the ones who raise their hands and say, this is the issue that I struggle with. So imposter syndrome is something that, most women know about today. They see themselves in the conversation. And so they're coming to me for support on that. But I'm really focused more recently on expanding that to include all humans who struggle in the ways that we're talking about. I'm trying to be more sort of gender inclusive in how I think about my work.
And what led you to that realization that men need it too?
I have to say, in some ways, it's selfishly motivated because I have 2 young boys that are growing up right now, and I want to make sure that they feel supported and seen in the workplace. And I just I've had the opportunity to have conversations privately with a number of men who have very vulnerably expressed to me some of the challenges that they're facing that I never would have known when I was working in the workplace. And, it's just men are socialized differently, so they don't often talk about what makes it hard for them at work, or they don't have the same kinds of support resources. So I think we sometimes assume, they've got it all worked out, right? And it's just smooth sailing for them. And I think when I started to open my eyes to the fact that, wow, it's not just women struggling, I wanted to be, more inclusive in how I thought about the work that I do, especially since I am such a champion of inclusion. It felt like, inclusion means everybody. And so
it does. It certainly does. And a lot of what you focus on in your work, and you have a podcast on the very topic, is around imposter syndrome. So let me start off by asking you, how do you define imposter syndrome?
So for me, imposter syndrome is that feeling we have that although everything's going well around us, right? Maybe we're achieving our goals, we're getting great feedback. Inside, there's a disconnect. It feels like it's only a matter of time before people figure out that we're a fraud, that, they think we're more capable than we actually are. And so there's this chronic anxiety associated with it because I'm always feeling like I'm one step away from outing myself as someone who's not actually qualified for the role that I'm in.
Mm-hmm. And how does it show up for people in their lives and in their work?
So a lot of the behaviors associated with imposter syndrome are playing small behaviors. So I'm not going to raise my hand and share this idea because if this were a good idea, someone else would have shared it already. Mm-hmm. Who am I to share this idea, right? It's not asking questions because I'm afraid that that's going to reveal what I don't know and others will find me out. It's, before I ask for a promotion or take on a new challenge, it's that belief that I'm not ready yet. I just need one more whatever in order to prepare for that. So it's a lot of those shrinking types of behaviors. I'm not actually stepping into my potential, taking risks. Interestingly, it may show up differently for men. We have traditionally thought of imposter syndrome as a women's issue. And for a very long time, it was assumed that only women struggled with it. All of the early research was done exclusively with women. I think it's important to recognize that because men and women have different expectations, that men often show up is more bullying, intimidating. They double down on their ideas because for them, the worst sin is looking weak. So I often say to people, be mindful of that because when you're dealing with people who show up that way, that's about them. Like true confidence, when you're really confident and you know where your strengths lie and where they don't, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You don't have to flex your muscles and make other people feel bad, right? So I think that it's important for all of us to understand this so that we don't allow someone else's behavior to undermine our sense of self and our sense of confidence in our own workplaces.
What's so interesting about that, it makes me think of a book that I can't remember the name of it or the author. So I'll remember that in a second. But the book is essentially about how gender bias informs a lot of things in our world because most things are built by and for men. And so the male experience is centered in what we know and what we build and what we develop. And it threads through all sectors and all things. And one of the examples that really sticks with me is she's talking about heart attacks and how the symptoms of a heart attack are different in men than they are in women. And the Hollywood heart attack that we're all sort of very familiar with from depictions in movies and TV is more synonymous with the male version. And the female symptoms of a heart attack, which present often very, very differently, because of that, a higher rate of women, the detection of a heart attack goes later because they don't know that they're having a heart attack because they're looking for the traditional sort of pain down the left side and clutching your chest. And in women, I think the specific symptoms, it can be more sort of in the stomach, more nausea, things like that. And so it's what as you were sharing that, I was thinking, if the symptoms, if that's the right word, or the characteristics of imposter syndrome can show up differently in women than men, then it's very easy to let it go a little bit more easily, or not to detect it or not spot it within men.
I think that's a great analogy. And that is a really disturbing thing that you just described, because, you're right. That creates a lot of risk. But it's true. I think, when men show up this way, it's perceived as a sign of strength. It's perceived as a sign of confidence. It doesn't seem like a problem that needs to be solved. But the reality is that when we experience imposter syndrome, we don't just undermine our own experience. It has a ripple effect on the people around us. If we're working for people with imposter syndrome, that can be challenging because they tend to be, very perfectionist in the way they go about their work. And that can be translated into micromanagement for the people that work for them. If I'm not sharing my ideas, I'm depriving the world around me of my insights and my perspective. And we talk a lot about the value of having different points of view. And if you are hiding your point of view because you're afraid, then we all lose out on that. So I do think it's really important that we look at this not as just an individual problem that needs to be addressed, but as a collective problem.
Well, I am so glad you shared that, Kim, because that's a real shift in my mind. I lead teams of people in various places, various businesses, various pursuits. And when I have identified or perhaps invited somebody to consider imposter syndrome and that they might be experiencing that, two things. One, it's always women. I've never had that conversation with a man, not because I don't think I've had men that have worked for me that have experienced imposter syndrome, but because I haven't spotted it, I haven't been looking for it. So that's number one. And then I definitely think of it as an individual challenge. This is something that's impacting you and it's sort of yours to fix, but I'll provide support and resources. And so shifting that gear toward there is a collective impact that's a very different way of thinking about imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I think it's a really important one right now, too, because there's a lot of talk about psychological safety. There's a lot of talk about inclusion. And I don't say this from a scientific point of view. I'm not pointing to any particular research. It's more anecdotal and experiential. But I'm a big believer that if we get it right when it comes to psychological safety and inclusion, we'll bring down the levels of imposter syndrome, because I think a lot of us are getting triggered by the fact that we work in these highly competitive, highly stressful environments. And it's really hard to function at your best when you're afraid of failing, because you are watching people around you that are getting their hands slapped for making a mistake, right? So it's like there's this cultural element to what we're talking about too, so it's not an individual in a vacuum, it's an individual that's responding to an environment around them.
Right, absolutely. My next question, I want to share a personal anecdote as an example of what I'm going to ask. So I recently went to a conference and there was a speaker talking about imposter syndrome, and I thought, I'm good. Like, I've done my own work around imposter syndrome. I'm cured. I'm going to go to this and see if I can find resources and tools and tips where I might be able to help team members of mine address imposter syndrome. So I go along and I'm listening to the speaker, and he's sharing his own experiences. And he was given an example for himself. He'd written a book and he was about imposter syndrome. And he was sharing that in writing the book about imposter syndrome, he was looking for a source for every point. Every single point he was putting in this book, he wanted to cite somebody else. And finally, his editor said, look, you're the expert on this. You've read and examined and studied and you've lived it. Like, you can have an opinion. You don't have to rely on these other experts. And I'm finding that in my own work that I'm doing around how supporting individuals in social change to do their very best work, I'm doing the same thing. That everything I say, everything I develop, I'm doing two things. One, I'm searching for, has anyone done this already? Because I don't want to be accused of plagiarizing or stealing ideas. And then I'm also backing it up. Is this scientific? Can I claim this to be sort of true? And so as he was sharing this experience and I realized I was doing exactly the same thing, it really made me confront my belief that I had cured my own imposter syndrome. And so my question is, to what extent can imposter syndrome be a hidden thing that we don't have a name for, and it's showing up in our lives in ways that we are not aware of?
I think that's a very good point, because I have had more people than I can count who have given a variation of your story. They've, after I've given a presentation on imposter syndrome, will come to me and say, I was here for others. I was convinced that this was not my issue. And now I think very differently about it. And so I do think it can fly under the radar, so to speak, because there are so many different manifestations of it. And that's one of the reasons why I think about managing imposter syndrome as not something that you manage at the top level. Like, when we talk about managing imposter syndrome, that is such a broad term. How do you get your arms around it, right? The biggest recommendation that I have for people is to start with observation. Pay attention to the moments when you feel this way. What is happening around you at that time? What is happening in your mind? Like, what are the stories you're telling yourself? What is happening interpersonally, the dynamics at play? Because in order to really manage imposter syndrome, you have to understand your unique triggers. Your triggers, as you just described them, are very different from mine and from anyone else's. And so it really has to be a custom solution, right? So
yes.
When like, oh, I am most likely to feel this way if I don't feel like I have read the definitive textbook before going into this meeting.
Yeah. Right.
Then that gives you information about how you can better manage that. Like, how do you manage that so that you can show up feeling more in control of the situation, feeling more confident in yourself?
Mm-hmm. And so how do you guide people in finding that customized solution for them?
So I think the principles are fairly universal. It's more so having the self-awareness to recognize where it shows up. So when you and I were chatting before hitting record, I was starting to talk about the fact that for me, even though imposter syndrome is not a medical diagnosis, it is not a psychiatric disorder, it does come with a lot of anxiety. And so as someone who has had a lifelong anxiety and has anxiety about a whole lot of other things too, it has really helped me to think about imposter syndrome as just a very natural, reflexive human response to fear. And so we have this security system in our brains that's always on alert for the threat of harm. And we just don't do a good job of distinguishing between the threat of a predator in the wild and the threat of something like failure or rejection, right? And so anytime our brain detects a threat, it activates that fight or flight response. We get the adrenaline rush and our stomach starts to flip and all the different feelings that are associated with that. And in that moment, it suppresses our cognitive functioning. So we're not able to reason, we're not able to problem solve, we're not able to think clearly. And so you see people, and I hear this all the time, people who say, I don't know what happens to me. It's like I step into this meeting and I lose my ability to form a coherent thought, right? Yeah. And, after hearing that so many times, it's time out, right? These are all intelligent, capable people. They're perfectly capable of having an articulate conversation with somebody else. What's happening when they step into these spaces is not that they've lost IQ points. It's that they don't feel safe. Their brain goes into fight or flight, and then they cannot access their thoughts in the way that they would like to. So for me, a lot of it comes down to knowing that response and intervening as soon as possible. So you're managing it in the same way that you would manage anxiety, but what contributes to your anxiety would be different from what contributes to mine, if that makes sense, right?
It does.
So, I have three very practical tips for when that happens. If you know your fight or flight response really well, you can act very quickly. And the first one is to take deep breaths, right? It sounds so cliche, I know. But the reason why this works is because it sends a very clear signal to your brain that it's a false alarm. Imagine you're being chased by a bear. Right? You couldn't stop and take a deep breath, right? So just the fact that you can stop and take a deep breath sort of stops the alarm system from going off. So it's really important to do that first. The other thing that I think is really helpful is to keep a drink with you at all times. It's a great pause button. If you are starting to fumble your words or you get blindsided by a question you weren't prepared for, just take a sip. Buy yourself some time, use it to breathe, collect yourself, and then come back to the conversation. And then finally, speak slowly. Pace yourself, because when we get nervous, we start talking really, really fast, and usually our thoughts can't keep up, right? Our thoughts are faster than our speech, and then we get tangled up in what we're trying to say. And when we're doing that, we're actually telling our brains, yes, indeed, this is a threat. And usually because other people are mirroring the energy around us, we're seeing that reflected back to us in other people's body language. And so it just has this spiraling effect. Whereas if I speak slowly, just the mere act of speaking slowly requires that I use my cognitive functioning. And so it keeps me out of fight or flight and makes me feel more in command of my message, which means other people are going to treat me accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. I love those tips. And I think, so as with anything, the things that you just outlined get easier with practice.
Yes.
But it's pretty difficult to practice something that happens the most when you are triggered and anxious.
Yes.
So how do you practice something that comes up the most when we're not our best selves?
Yeah. So I think about this as having a before, during, and after.
Okay.
Right. So we often talk about it in terms of what do I do in the middle of that moment when I don't have the capacity to strategize because my brain is in a totally different space right now. So I think about that's the value of really observing first and writing it down, like jotting down notes of what was going on in that meeting, what happened at that moment. And then you can come back and you can start to say, okay, what am I really afraid of here? What is it that really is triggering me about this? And then you can start to problem solve, right? So for people who are really afraid that they're going to look less than perfect in a meeting if they can't answer every single question, what are you most afraid of? And plan for that. Plan for what you're most afraid of. So often it's, I'm going to be asked a question I don't know the answer to. Okay, that's going to happen someday. Someday you're going to be asked that. So what will you do if that does happen? And then you sort of plot out your thoughts, your plan. You can think about what resources I want to bring into the room with me if I'm feeling like I don't have adequate, experience in this area. It's all about taking control of a situation that's making you feel like you don't have enough control. So you can't, it's hard. It's not like we have fire drills for our brain. But I think the more you think about it, the more you plan for it, keep visual cues available to you because you won't be able to access these thoughts in the moment. So I always think about those 3 steps, like put them on a sticky note in front of you on your laptop or, have some bullets with you and when you go into the room. And, practice in personal spaces too. Practice in spaces when you're with your team, when things are lower stakes, because then you're building the muscles that will prepare you for when you're in a much higher stakes environment. And then after the fact, you can always go back to somebody later and say, I gave you my first response when you asked, but upon further reflection, right, I have a different or an expanded response to that question. I think we always feel like it's so high stakes in that moment, but to just revisit it.
Well, and in my experience, because I definitely do that. And in my experience, when you do that, whoever you're talking to, whether it's a client or a coworker or whoever, what it really signals to them is that you care and you've been thinking about this thing. And so my experience has been, and when people do that to me, I certainly don't interpret it, and I don't think it comes across as any sort of failing or incompetence, but in fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think, there are some times when it is appropriate. You may not always feel psychologically safe enough to do this, but sometimes it's appropriate to own that in the moment, because a lot of times people who are more introverted or who like to process information first really struggle when asked to think on their feet. And if you are someone who identifies that way, that your first response is probably not going to be your best response or your most thoughtful response. So you might even say, you know what, my preference would be to spend some time thinking about this first and get back to you. But if you need an immediate response, here it is. Right?
Yeah. And how important is it that those behaviors around us are being modeled? Because if we see others doing that, it's so much easier to do it ourselves, isn't it?
Yes. And so that's actually what I was thinking about when you were talking about wanting to provide services to your team. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do to support your team is to just talk to them like a fellow human and let them know these are the kinds of things that make me nervous. These are the things that activate my imposter syndrome, and to be vulnerable so that they can be vulnerable too.
Yeah. Yeah. So certainly my own experience the last year or so has been with imposter syndrome is when I think about what has triggered it and why, I think I was cured, and then I sort of discovered, no, this continues for me, is that I did have an experience where somebody did question my credentials and sort of challenged me a bit. And that has just sown such a seed of doubt and self-doubt that just festers there. And it doesn't matter how many times I challenge it or how many people I've talked it through with, or it's just always there in the background. And so can you talk a little bit about what you do with that? Like when somebody, it stops being sort of a fear and it becomes a reality that actually you are challenged in some way and your credentials are challenged.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I think about when it comes to this kind of anxiety or this kind of doubt that we carry around with us is that it's useful to the extent that it gives us information, right? So that was data that you were presented with. This person came to you and shared this perspective, but they are not the end all be all of credibility and credentialing in your space, right? And so oftentimes, we take feedback as gospel, and it's like we put these people on pedestals, especially if they're people that we admire or that we think have more experience than we do. And so it can be helpful to engage in some mindset exercises like, well, what evidence do I have that what that person shared is not true, right? And try to put things in perspective as opposed to putting all of your, eggs in that person's basket, for lack of a better term, right? Because who are they? Like, yeah, maybe they have a valid viewpoint. And in that case, it becomes a question of, are there pieces of my, experience that are literally missing, right? Like, are there gaps that I would benefit from filling? Is there something that they're sharing with me that I can learn from? In which case, that's useful anxiety because it's productive. It's leading you forward down a better path. But if it's just nagging at you and you're ruminating about it, it's no longer useful. It's just constantly there ready to undermine you when you're in an important situation.
Oh man, is it ever? It absolutely is. And so can you ever be cured is my idea. Like, oh, I'm cured. I'm over this. This isn't something I struggle with anymore. Is that even a thing?
I think of it less as being cured and more as you get to a point where you understand it better, you manage it better, so it becomes far less disruptive. But the thing about imposter syndrome is that it often strikes at times of transition. So when you're making a change, you are probably perfectly comfortable in wherever you were before you made that change. And now you're in, doing something different and you're the new kid again. And you're so aware of what you don't know and you're intimidated by the people around you. So don't be surprised, for everyone listening, if you feel like, oh, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, but I'm feeling much better now. And then the next time you make a change, it's back again, because it's very episodic. But if you understand it, then you can intervene more quickly this time around.
Well, and I think that is so relevant for people listening who are involved in social change, whether they do it professionally or they volunteer their time and energy to make a difference in the world. And in this, though, if you're trying to change the world, there's change in it all the time. Like, things shift all the time. If you're doing something electorally, there's elections every few months, really, if you include all the stuff that happens on a local level. People leave office, unexpected things happen, and we don't have control over any of it. Policies change, landscapes change, organizations shift. And you're trying to, oftentimes I think about like trying to create positive community change, but doing so like standing on a surfboard. And it's just always, like the waves underneath you are just always rippling. And then sometimes there's a massive wave that comes and like knocks you off. And so in that environment, I would imagine that imposter syndrome, that the conditions for imposter syndrome to run riot are there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because we want predictability in our lives. We want to know what's going to happen on the other side of this decision, on the other side of this step that I take. And when you're doing something different, when you're involved in change, it's inherently new, right? You don't have the guidebook that's going to help you through it. And so part of it is really being mindful of what your expectations are. If you're being attached to like an old way of doing things, you're going to be just out of sync with the reality of your situation. And so it's about really defining, what does success look like in these new circumstances, not what was I dependent on in the past. And that can be a really uncomfortable space to navigate. But I think even just recognizing, change is likely to trigger this in me. And when it happens, I will, I kind of can anticipate it, and I have tools to help me manage it. And that alone makes you feel a little bit less anxious about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so is there one sort of main point or main piece of advice that you think people need to keep in mind when they're thinking about, how do I tackle imposter syndrome?
I think this is, sort of a joke that I say all the time, but it's rooted in truth. As I always say, that managing imposter syndrome is about revealing the absurdity of our thinking, right? Because we accept at face value all of these ridiculous things that we tell ourselves, like, I should be perfect on day one of something new, or I should already know this, or, all of these things that when we take them out, put them in the light and examine them, we start to realize, like, actually, why would I think that I would be perfect at something that I've never tried before? And so I think, the way that I think about it is that anytime you experience any type of discomfort, like anger, frustration, stress, anxiety, doubt, think of it as your brain's check engine light, right? Like you would have on your car. When the check engine light goes off, you want to look under the hood. You want to see something just triggered that. Something's going on, right? So similarly, when you feel uncomfortable, you use it as an opportunity to push pause and investigate it further. Wait, what just happened? Why am I responding that way? What's true about this situation versus what is just my brain thinking that something terrible is happening? And what are the action steps that I can take right now? Because we are moving at such a fast pace that most of our behavior is reactive. We're not responding, we're reflexively reacting to the situations around us. So if we can really tune into those physiological experiences that come up for us, it slows us down long enough to actually think and reframe and strategize in ways that will help us, again, feel more in control than if we're just rushing through it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I think, something I thought about when we were talking earlier about, that's what it was, when we were talking about modeled behavior and being able to witness other people, I was thinking about how hearing other people's experiences with anxiety and imposter syndrome and self-doubt have been really helpful for me, which leads me into my question about your podcast. So you have a podcast dedicated to this topic. So tell us a little bit about what it's called and where it came from.
Yeah, so thank you. It's called the Imposter Syndrome Files. And the reason I called it that was because I had this image of like secret files that people have been, keeping to themselves, and nobody wants to be out there talking about their own personal story. But having done this work for so long and talked to people individually, I've had more people ask me questions like, am I the only one who says this to you? Am I crazy? Is it just me? And finally, I just had this light bulb moment one day and thought, I want to do a podcast where I take this conversation public, where I have a one-on-one conversation every week with someone who's willing to reveal their deep, dark secret around imposter syndrome. And let's talk about what are some ways that we can think about it? How has it shown up in their world? So that hopefully people listening would hear themselves in those conversations and A, feel that sense of relief of, oh, good, it's not just me. And B, walk away with some things that they could actually do. And it's been 3.5 years now. And I've had so many important conversations, and everyone's a little bit different. Everything has a little bit of a different angle on it, but it's all designed with that in mind of just like normalizing this experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some of the things that you learned from your guests?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have to think about that for a second. I think that there's still, it's funny because no matter how many conversations I have, they still surprise me. I still have that sense of you with your background, you feel that way too, even though I know and I study this stuff. And so I think for me, I always learn something about how universal this experience is, and everyone has a slightly different relationship to it. But when you boil it all down, we're all struggling with the same basic fears and challenges as humans, and they just express themselves differently. And it just keeps getting reinforced through the conversations I'm having.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, so imposter syndrome is fairly new syntax. It's newish. It's only sort of a few years, or at least I've only really been aware of it for a number of years. It has a name. And I'm wondering if there are, you have shared the root of imposter syndrome is anxiety. And so presumably imposter syndrome is one of the ways that it shows up, but that all different shades of fear and self-doubt are related. Yeah,
so there's actually a difference. So imposter syndrome tends to be more specifically focused on how we see ourselves as it relates to our competence in our work. Self-esteem is more how we see ourselves more broadly in our lives. So I can feel like an imposter at work and feel perfectly content and confident in my personal life. I can feel like an imposter in this particular project and still feel in other situations like I'm doing great. There are more pervasive forms of self-doubt that are more self-esteem related, self-worth related experiences. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. And that's why I think it's important to pay attention to what's triggering it, because then you'll know, am I addressing the right problem?
Yeah. And how do you figure that out?
I think you would want to look at, is this something that I feel in all of my interactions or most of my interactions across my life, right? Is this something that I feel just as powerfully when I'm with my friends as I do when I'm with my colleagues, right? If it stretches across your experience, then there's probably something deeper going on. But if you can kind of think about, is there something about this specific situation? Again, it's usually at a time of change. It's usually if you work in a really competitive environment. It's usually if you feel different from the people around you. So there are certain kinds of predictable connection points to imposter syndrome, then you can probably isolate it a little bit more easily. But either way, I think it's worth seeking support, because it is so hard to do this on your own. It's really hard to have the presence of mind to be more objective about it, to even know where to begin to find resources. So I don't say that, selfishly. I think therapy is actually a really appropriate place for people who are struggling beyond imposter syndrome. But I just encourage people to not feel like this is something you have to take on entirely by yourself.
And if someone's listening and they've been listening to our conversation, it's resonating with them and they're thinking, oh yeah, this is me. What is the very first thing that you would advise them to do?
So I would advise them to start with that observation, because before you take any action at all, you want to have the lay of the land, right? So really, if you're listening and you're thinking, this is me, spend the next week just paying attention to yourself in relationship to your surroundings and get a really clear picture of what is going on and what these triggers are. And then the action becomes, how do I break down the triggers into actionable steps, right? Yeah. And then I do have a free resource on my website too that's designed to help people better understand their experience with imposter syndrome. I call it a 7-day challenge. Every day for 7 days, you get an email where it just asks you some self-reflection questions. So that could be a resource too, just as a starting point.
Yeah. And tell us your website address.
It's kimmeninger.com.
And if people want to connect with you online, is that the best place to do it? Are there other places that they can follow your work?
Yeah, LinkedIn is where I'm most active, and I am always looking to grow my network. So anybody who would like to is welcome to connect with me there as well.
Wonderful. So, Kim, what is your vision for your work? Where would you like it to go?
My honest answer to that is I'd love to work myself out of a job.
Yes, right.
I would love for this to no longer be an issue that we talk about. But I think for now, I'm focusing on expanding the conversation as broadly as possible so that as many people as needed have more access to the information, the tools, the self-awareness, so that it doesn't feel as crippling as it otherwise might, and that we can all feel like we're in this shared journey, as miserable as it may be from time to time. We're in it together.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Kim, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and just a lot of tangible tips I know I'm going to be using. So I'm incredibly grateful to you for the time that you've spent and the energy you've given us.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I so appreciate your questions and this conversation and the work that you're doing as well.
Wasn't that the most incredible conversation? I loved how Kim talked about imposter syndrome, how it shows up differently in everybody. That was one of my biggest takeaways, is how it shows up differently in everybody. I think I'm really going to have to think about that. I think it's really going to shift how I approach this imposter syndrome in my teams, because I have definitely been guilty in the past of thinking that the signs or the symptoms of imposter syndrome in others are how it shows up for me. And so that was a really big takeaway. I also loved how she talked about oftentimes when you're first triggered and you're feeling that sense of anxiety, that taking a deep breath is a sign to the brain that it's a false alarm, that you're not actually in danger. Because in the situations where you are in danger, like being chased by a bear, per Kim's example, you are not stopping and taking a breath. And I know that deep breathing helps me calm down when I'm anxious, but I love that idea of like what I'm doing is I'm telling my brain, which will tell my body, we're safe, this is a false alarm. Loved that. And I also loved I don't know that I love this idea, but it was very, very helpful that oftentimes imposter syndrome can show up in shrinking behaviors. So we tend to step back from challenges or step back from new roles. And for you in your work as a change maker, whether you do that in your volunteer capacity, your spare time, in your family, or professionally, whatever it is, doing really effective change work takes boldness and it takes risk. And so we think that this conversation about imposter syndrome is so important. And if you have enjoyed this conversation, I really, really would encourage you, and it would mean a lot to me if you would share it with somebody that you think would would find it valuable. So whether you share it on your social media or if you send it to a friend directly, I just really want to get these tools out in the world to help people that are creating change, because that's how we're going to make a material difference in our world. Thank you so much for joining me on Change in You, and I look forward to seeing you back here again next time.